I thought I had seen the worst kinds of relationships. In over a decade of working as a couples therapist, I had sat across from people who had betrayed each other in every way imaginable. I had witnessed marriages crumble under the weight of infidelity, manipulation, resentment, and sometimes even violence. I had learned to recognize the signs, the subtle shifts in tone, the defensive body language, the cracks beneath carefully constructed facades, but nothing prepared me for Daniel and Sarah. They walked into my office on a quiet Thursday afternoon, rain tapping gently against the windows. At first glance, they seemed like the kind of couple you would expect to see in a lifestyle magazine. They were well-dressed, composed, and strangely in sync. They smiled as they introduced themselves, their voices calm and measured. They even held hands as they sat down, their fingers interlocked as if they were trying to reassure each other, or perhaps present a certain image to me. If I had to describe them in one word, it would have been perfect. And that was the first thing that made me uneasy. They told me they were struggling with communication. It was a common complaint, one I had heard countless times before. Couples often came to therapy because they felt misunderstood, unheard, or disconnected. So I began the session the way I always did, asking open-ended questions, encouraging them to speak freely about their experiences. But something felt off almost immediately. Whenever I asked a question that required a deeper or more personal answer, Daniel would glance at Sarah. It was quick, barely noticeable, but deliberate. And Sarah would respond with a subtle nod or shift in expression, as if giving silent approval. Only then would he speak. At first, I told myself I was overanalyzing. Couples often develop small, unconscious habits over time, but as the sessions continued, the pattern became impossible to ignore. They weren't just communicating with me, they were coordinating. By the third session, my discomfort had grown into quiet suspicion. Their answers were too polished, too aligned. It felt less like I was listening to two individuals and more like I was being presented with a rehearsed narrative. That was when Sarah said something that changed everything. She leaned back in her chair, a faint smile on her face, and said in a light, almost playful tone, "Sometimes I wish he would just disappear, you know?" Daniel didn't react with shock or confusion. Instead, he smiled. "Yeah," he said casually, "we joke about that a lot." They both laughed, but I didn't. There was something about the way she said it, something beneath the humor that didn't sit right. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration. It was something colder, something more controlled. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but from that moment on, I started paying closer attention. Over the next few sessions, the tone of their discussions shifted. They began to describe their arguments in greater detail, but not in the way most couples do. There was no emotional confusion, no attempt to justify or explain. Instead, they spoke about their conflicts with a strange sense of detachment, almost like analysts reviewing data. Sarah once said, "Last week's fight was interesting." "He lasted longer than usual." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, but you escalated too quickly, it made it less effective." I paused, unsure if I had heard them correctly. "Less effective?" I asked. They both turned to me as if I had interrupted something obvious. "Yes," Sarah said, "if it peaks too early, it doesn't have the same impact." Impact, the word lingered in the air. It became clear that they weren't talking about arguments the way most couples do. They weren't discussing disagreements or emotional outbursts. They were discussing performance. In one session, Sarah casually mentioned that she had made Daniel cry in 6 minutes during their last argument. She said it with the same pride someone might have when talking about a personal achievement. Daniel didn't seem embarrassed. If anything, he appeared impressed. "I wasn't expecting it to hit that fast," he admitted. "It was well done." I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't normal conflict, this was something else entirely. The moment that truly unsettled me came during their 7th session. Daniel mentioned, almost in passing, that they sometimes recorded their arguments. I asked why. "To analyze them later," he said. There was no hesitation in his voice, no sign that he thought this might be unusual. I asked if I could hear one of the recordings. For the first time since they had entered my office, they hesitated. They exchanged a look, longer this time, more deliberate. It was as if they were silently debating whether to let me in on something deeper. Eventually, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "Just one," she said. She pressed play. At first, it sounded like any other argument. Their voices were raised, emotions seemed high, and the words they exchanged were sharp and cutting. If I had heard only the first minute, I might not have thought much of it. But then something changed. Their voices dropped, not gradually but suddenly. The anger vanished, replaced by a strange, almost mechanical calmness. Then Sarah said something that made my stomach tighten. "Say the part about leaving me." There was no anger in her voice, no sadness, just instruction. And Daniel responded instantly as if he had been waiting for the cue. "I can't do this anymore, I'm done." His tone was flat, controlled, and completely devoid of emotion. It didn't sound like a man ending a relationship. It sounded like an actor delivering a line. The recording ended shortly after that. The room fell into silence. That was the moment everything clicked into place. They weren't just having arguments. They were rehearsing them, practicing emotional pain, refining it, perfecting it. I asked them directly why they were doing this. They didn't seem defensive. They didn't try to deny it. Instead, they looked at each other as they always did, and then Sarah spoke. "Because real emotions aren't enough anymore." Her voice was calm, almost thoughtful. Daniel nodded. "We got bored. After 11 years together, they hadn't experienced a dramatic betrayal or a devastating conflict. There was no clear trauma driving their behavior. They had simply reached a point where normal emotional experiences no longer felt sufficient, so they created their own. They began designing arguments the way someone might design an experiment. They set conditions, tested reactions, and evaluated outcomes. They pushed each other further and further, not out of anger but out of curiosity. They wanted to feel something stronger. Something more intense, something real. But the more they chased that feeling, the more artificial their interactions became. They even established rules. "No physical harm," Daniel explained. "No involving other people," Sarah added. "And we always stop if one of us uses the safe word." I stared at them, unsure how to respond. A safe word. Not for physical danger, but for emotional escalation. It was as if they had turned their relationship into a controlled environment for psychological experimentation. I told them as clearly as I could that this was not healthy, that what they were doing could have serious long-term consequences, that they needed to stop immediately. Sarah listened carefully, then smiled. "That's why we came to you," she said. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head slightly, studying my reaction. "To see how far we can go before someone tells us to stop." Her words settled heavily in the room. In that moment, I realized something deeply unsettling. I wasn't helping them. I was part of their process, another variable in their experiment, another boundary to test. I ended the session early. I told them I could no longer continue working with them as a couple and recommended individual therapy instead. It was the only ethical decision I could make. They didn't argue. They didn't question it. They simply stood up, thanked me politely, and walked out of the office, hand in hand, just as they had entered. They were smiling. I never saw them again. Months passed, and I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself that I had done what I could, that some cases are beyond intervention. But then one day, I received an email. There was no subject line, no greeting, just a single sentence. "We finally felt something." I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to understand what they meant. I still don't. And I'm not sure I want to, because the most disturbing part of their story wasn't that they were broken. It was that they were fully aware of what they were doing. Every word, every action, every calculated moment of emotional harm, it was all intentional. They chose it, and that is what continues to unsettle me. In my profession, you expect to encounter pain, dysfunction, and human weakness. You learn to navigate it, to guide people toward healthier patterns. But cases like this remind you of something far more uncomfortable. Sometimes, the most dangerous situations aren't born from chaos or loss of control. Sometimes they come from people who understand exactly what they're doing and decide to do it anyway.